I get a little bit tired when some of our leaders of our utilities here will go and say, oh, it was a once in a 500-year storm. I was like, no, this 500-year storm is happening every 3 years.
That was the voice of Josh Elling from Jefferson East. And today, we're talking about what I think is one of the most important stories in Metro Detroit. You know, when you look at all those maps online about where the oceans are going to rise and all that other stuff, you might get lulled into this sense that climate change won't hit us. Well, I've got news for you. It has, it will even more, and it will become one of the biggest stories to deal with in Southeast Michigan. Now, today we're going to focus on Jefferson East, a part of town that I am very fond of, but the topics we hit are going to impact everyone here. So I really encourage you to take a listen. I'm Jerry Stays, and this is your Daily Detroit for Thursday, May 5th, 2022, and let's just get to it. Joining me virtually back on the show, Josh Elling from Jefferson East. Welcome back to Daily Detroit.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to hear your voice.
A ton of things to talk about, but I guess first we'll get into flooding because that is something that, it's spring. There were a lot of incidents and things last year. It's this story that just won't go away. It was part of the, mayoral and council elections. For you, being in a position of being on the ground with a very community-focused organization, how has this hit you and what you're dealing with?
Unfortunately, it was the event last June was just all-encompassing, not just for the East Jefferson corridor and the Jefferson Chalmers neighborhood, but the entire region. I mean, when you have 8+ inches of rain drop in about 3 hours, that's going to cause problems. And what we really realize is the neighborhoods that, like Jefferson Chalmers, that are kind of at the end of the funnel, right? So all of the sewer and wastewater is running down from the entire east side of the metro area, kind of down to the Detroit River Interceptor, which is the big sewer feed that runs under Jefferson. Everything's flowing down there. So when you have problems, it all flows downstream. Jefferson Chalmers, because it's effectively below sea level, it's actually a little bit below the lake level, it backs up first. And so in the June event, we basically had within Jefferson Chalmers and the Marina District alone, we had close to 5,000 homes that had between, 3 inches and 9.5 feet of water in their basements, right? So you had that impact. On top of that, you had massive just surface flooding. So people lost cars, people had water going through windows in their basements. So you had that. Where we had to quickly get engaged was getting residents plugged into, disaster relief services. We've been very fortunate, thanks to a lot of the funding support we've received from like the United Way and the Kresge Foundation, DTE, as well as McGregor Foundation. We were able to deploy sort of flood recovery resources into people's basements, help them muck the basements out, get the furnaces repaired, get the hot water tanks repaired. And then also the Van Elzer Foundation gave us a nice donation to get people's furnaces back online. So to date, we're running north of having helped residents, about 50 furnaces be replaced, about 37 hot water tanks be replaced. But even a year out from this event, we still have residents whose basements were not mucked out, where flood damage debris was not removed. And so just next week, we're starting a program with a great another partner nonprofit, CEO, or the Center for Equitable Employment Opportunities. We're going to be going into folks' basements to help them muck out and sanitize the basement so we then can deploy more flooding recovery resources into those basements. But you basically had a complete failure of the stormwater infrastructure. And one, it was simply overwhelmed by the amount of rain. Jeff Chalmers was particularly a hard hit because you had the pumping stations that would normally pump the water out of that neighborhood. They went down. Not all the pumps were running. It really just exposed the vulnerability of a lot of our neighborhoods to this new normal we're dealing with, due to climate change, of these extreme precipitation events. And so we're finding ourselves at Jefferson East at this sort of fusion between disaster recovery, home repair, and then now also infrastructure advocacy, so how we can try to fix this problem in the long term. It's a little overwhelming, but we're making good progress. But there's a lot to work through.
I can only imagine because, there's so much momentum that you're starting to get going, not just in Jefferson Chalmers, but in various parts of that east side Jefferson corridor that Jefferson East serves. It's got to be really frustrating to see this, because this is the kind of thing that maybe makes people more apprehensive of doing things in a place like that.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Jefferson Chalmers, right? I mean, our friends, at Church of the Messiah, their basement flooded and several $100,000 in damage. Folks in the villages flooded. I mean, Lafayette Park, there was damage here in Rivertown. These extreme precipitation events are just, the storm system cannot handle it. Our sewer and wastewater pipes cannot handle it. One of the big challenges that we face regionally is on a dry day, the sewer pipes right under the street are 75% full. Basically, just from normal flow from the 4.5 or 6 million people the area serves, and then percolation of groundwater sort of percolating into all these old pipes. So on a dry day, you're at 75% full. Throw a little bit of rain on that, you only got 25% slack in the system. So you're going to get basement backups.
And people who aren't familiar with the topography of the area, they might not know that a number of small rivers, creeks, things like that were buried as sewer pipes throughout the region.
Yeah, exactly. So, you had Connor Creek that was covered over and is a discharge now. You've got the Milk River Basin. You've got Fox Creek on the east side. And then you have other problematic things. If we go over to the west side and you think about what happened in the city of Dearborn, which also really just took it in the teeth with the flood, and the east side of Dearborn especially, the outflows in Dearborn for when they would do wastewater discharges, right, or sewage discharges in extreme events, those would spill out into the Rouge River down about, I think, around Zug Island. Well, guess what? The Rouge was so high, those discharges were underwater. So that was one of the big drivers why you got the massive basement backups on the east side of Dearborn. And so, I won't forget having been down to JC during the event, waiting around, trying to get storm drains unclogged, helping people with their, basements. And then I drove back over to Dearborn to visit my mom and drive to the east side of Dearborn and just seeing the canyons of debris there. And I was like, okay, this is affecting basically neighborhoods that are at the end of the funnel, as we like to call it, low-lying topography with more aging infrastructure. And so one of the things that we are excited about that we're going to be able to do is, thanks to our friends at the Kresge Foundation, we are bringing up here to Detroit early in June here a specialized training for our friends at the city of Detroit, at the city of Dearborn, and the state of Michigan. This training is going to work to educate our leader practitioners on how to deploy community development block grant funds that are focused on disaster recovery. I'm sure a lot of folks saw the news, how the city of Detroit got, I think it was like $56.5 million. City of Dearborn got $17 million, and the state got the residual of about $8 million. And this was from what they call CDBG-DR, CDBG Disaster Recovery. And so these funds can be used to help residents recover from the floods, help business districts recover from the floods, but also start to look at what are the long-term solutions or mitigation efforts that we could put in place to help protect people's basements and make our storm systems here much more resilient. So we're going to be doing this training in partnership with a well-known national nonprofit, SBP Inc., out of New Orleans, that was set up after Hurricane Katrina to help homeowners, and now they help entire states recover from disasters. So we're going to be excited to plug that expertise and train some of our local leaders on how to effectively deploy CDBG-DR. But I mean, what we're really looking at here now is, as a region, we have to examine how are we going to upgrade this wastewater and sewer shed infrastructure. And then in Jefferson Chalmers and along the river here, we've got a double whammy. We've got to figure out a way to raise the seawalls to get, like, the Jefferson Chalmers neighborhood, the Marina District neighborhood, portions of the Gold Coast in the villages out of the floodplain. Because last October, FEMA finalized their new floodplain maps that placed all of Jeff Chalmers, a good chunk of the Marina District, and pieces of the villages within the new federally designated floodplain. What this means is not only do residents bear the added cost of flood insurance, but this is preventing the city of Detroit from being able to deploy its traditional economic development tools, namely CDBG funds and home funds that have been the linchpin of redevelopment throughout the city. So this has effectively frozen the ability to use public funds to support redevelopment efforts in those neighborhoods until the neighborhood can be taken out of the floodplain. So this is something that we're very, very troubled by. And I know the city is looking diligently at a study that the Corps of Engineers recently released, which lays out what would have to happen to the seawalls to get the neighborhood out of the floodplain. But that fix isn't going to be cheap. That's going to be anywhere from 35 million, maybe up to 170 to 180 million. And that's just to get Jeff Chalmers out of the floodplain.
Wow.
What's the cost to get the Marina District? And what do we do about the seawalls down there in the villages too? So yeah, there's no shortage of infrastructure need to deal with this problem.
Now, this is something that you understand is tied to climate change. Like this is the way it's going to be going forward, right?
Well, if you look at a lot of the models, right, the sort of the National Assessment of Climate Change and a lot of the climate models that are out there, they're all pointing to more extreme precipitation events, especially in this region and sort of throughout the Midwest. So while the West Coast and the Southwest will be dealing with drought, the South will be dealing with obviously increased temperatures in a warmer climate. If there's more heat in the atmosphere, there's more energy in the atmosphere, and these storms can just store more energy, right, and more moisture, and they can dump a lot more moisture. So I get a little bit tired when some of our leaders of our utilities here will go and say, "Oh, it was a once in a 500-year storm." I was like, "No, this 500-year storm is happening every 3 years." Right? And we have to start planning for this. Now, I feel their pain a little bit because the cost of redoing all of our infrastructure here would just be astronomical. If you think about the scope of the Great Lakes Water Authority and DWSD, with basically running up to Flint, it's a massive, massive system. And the fix for this to increase the capacity of the stormwater system is just astronomical. And I can't even put a number on it, but tens of billions of dollars.
Those are the kinds of numbers I've heard with some other conversations.
Yeah.
And even the idea of in some areas separating the sewers.
Right. Yeah. CSO separation is a big thing. I think in neighborhoods like Jefferson Chalmers, where you're close to the lake level, you've got enhanced sort of percolation into the old pipes. CSO separation, separating the sanitary from the wastewater, I think is incredibly important. Now, it's not a fix. Right. So they did that in Dearborn. So they did CSO separation in Dearborn over the last, 15, 20 years or so. And that didn't prevent the basement backups on the east side. So it doesn't fix everything, but it's a good thing to start. One of the things that we found was very effective, and we sort of got real life demonstration of this, is in the buildings that our development subsidiary, EJ Devco, develops, we always program in a combination of green stormwater infrastructure and on-site retention. So if you ever go to Norma G's Caribbean Cuisine there at Manistee and Jefferson, or if you stop by our new neighborhood resource hub at Lakewood in Jefferson, take a minute and go look at the parking lot. It's going to look like a normal parking lot. However, all the wastewater in that parking lot runs into these gigantic sort of underground storage containers, or caissons, if you will, that are open on the bottom, and then they rest on about 10, 12 feet of gravel. So when the water from that parking lot floods into those caissons, it slowly percolates down through the groundwater, and so it's not dumping into the sewer system. Now, back in 2014, when we had, I think it was a 6-inch rain event over 12 hours, the Kresge building, we just bought the building at the time, the Kresge building ended up with like 4 feet of water in the basement.
Ooh.
This time around, when the 8 inches dropped on Jeff Chalmers, the Kresge building basement did not flood.
Wow.
Right? So we think that the on-site retention we built on that lot took enough pressure off the sewer lines in the alley there that we didn't get the same force of backup. We'd also done other things. We had check valves installed. We'd upgraded the plumbing. All those things made the building much more resilient to these events. But we also, in talking to the adjacent property owners, we realized that the water level in their basements that they got was much, much, much lower than 2014. The church behind Norma G's didn't have as much water. But I know they had also installed a check valve after 2014. So there's efforts you can do that can take some pressure off the immediate system and then harden these buildings with check valves and things like that can make the basements a little more resilient. Now, I'll tell you a frustration point, though. Down the street, we have our Marlboro apartment project, which is we've been working on for right now, seems like a billion years.
Is that the one near the Yellow Light Donuts?
Yes, yeah. So the north building is right behind Yellow Light Donut. The south building is just south on Marlboro.
Gotcha.
And the south building, we were about a week away from delivering units back in June, and the storm hit. And what happened on that building was our check valves held and things like that. Water came in through the windows because the sewer and drain was overwhelmed in the alley and the water came in through the windows. And so we had about $500,000 in flood damage. We just got that fixed last week, and we're going to be delivering that building a little bit later this month. But that's an example of the public infrastructure has been completely overwhelmed. And in our case, it caused $500,000 in damage and delayed delivery of a building by almost a year. But I think part of this is if we can bake more of these GSI and on-site retentions at scale throughout the region, it'll help to deal with some of these issues while we look at other investments that need to go on underground.
Yeah. If someone's hearing this and they may not live right next to Jefferson Chalmers, but so many areas were touched by flooding. And I think every single part of this region has a role to play in this because all of this stuff is connected. And if there's anything that I've learned, like nature doesn't care about your city or county boundaries.
Yeah. Well, and water always wins. That's the
It
other thing
does.
too. So, I know that SEMCOG's gotten very active in this, which is the Southeastern Michigan Council of Governments. I know the mayor's team is looking at this. I know a lot of our major corporate partners like Bedrock and things are also looking at this issue. What I worry about, though, is I'm not sure that we have the regional governance structure to effectively deal with this. We spun off GLWA. It's got its own board. They don't really have the ability to effectively manage wastewater. And what I mean by that is they don't have the funding structure in place to effectively deal with this over the long term, right? There has been talk about, do we need to create a new wastewater management utility, which would be able to bond, which would be able to have sort of a ratepayer structure that would support these broad-based, wastewater management tactics that needs to go on. Do we need to look at doing things like an environmental impact bond? This is something that Buffalo and Milwaukee did very effectively, in which the local government there issued an environmental impact bond to allow to expand use of green stormwater infrastructure. I want to tell you another interesting one too. When we had been working on a multi-property brownfield tax increment finance district. Now go ahead and say that 10 times fast. But this was going to allow us in Jefferson Chalmers to kind of qualify the entire business district as a brownfield, allowing us to utilize tax increment finances. And basically is a portion of the increase in property tax revenue is captured by the district, and you can then reinvest it in the district in infrastructure and remediation and like lead abatement, demo, stuff like that, right?
And the tax increment finance tool is one that's used by a lot of places, like all over the place.
It is used a lot of places, but in Michigan is one of the few states, in the city of Detroit, one of the few cities that only uses brownfield tax increment financing on a per project basis.
Oh.
So like an individual project can have a brownfield plan. So for example, when our friends at Stellantis did the plant expansion, they put together a brownfield plan and were able to get, like tens of millions of dollars in brownfield tax increment financing to support the plant. When Dan Gilbert's putting up his skyscraper downtown, there's something like, like several $100 million of TIFA dollars on that project for brownfield costs. So we have a long history of using this tool throughout the state, and Michigan is really actually considered a leader in its deployment of brownfield TIFs. But we don't do them on a district level. We haven't found an effective way to do a large area all at once. And so this is especially problematic in neighborhood commercial districts like Jefferson Chalmers or West Warren, or if you think about up on Grand River and whatnot. A brownfield plan is expensive. If a project wants to put a brownfield plan together to do all the engineering, the analysis, sort of the legal work, then go through the DBRA and all this fun stuff, that's going to cost anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000, sometimes maybe even $250,000. If you're a small property owner with only like a 4,000 square foot building, you're not going to do that, right? Because it just costs a lot of money up front and you're not going to get a lot in the back end.
The ROI doesn't make sense. And
exactly.
To me, the first thing I'm hearing when you say this is that this could be an on-ramp for more kinds of developers, more kinds of investors, more kinds of, frankly, even like neighborhood level businesses. We talk about the disparity in the city of Detroit between your big projects and your small ones and how small ones are hard to do. This to me seems like a way to give a hand up to those smaller projects.
We should have my co-CEO Derek Scott back on, who was brilliant person who put this plan together, right? And that's exactly right. Existing property owners could benefit from it too because they could utilize it on their existing structures for like lead remediation and things like that. It's a much more democratic application of brownfield TIFA or tax increment finance. But anyway, I digress a little bit. That's an important topic we should talk about another day. What this multi-property brownfield TIFA district was going to do in JC, it was going to allow us to basically do a lot of green stormwater infrastructure, redo the alleys with GSI work and on-site retention. And we had lined up a whole bunch of debt that was going to be bonded by this, and we were ready to go. But because it's so new here in the city, I don't think the city was ready for it. And so we weren't able to do that. So we're back to this sort of onesie twosie building at a time. But to my earlier point about, I'm worried we don't have the governance infrastructure or the financial tools or the willingness to use new financial tools, I should say. We have them, we just don't use them. So we've really got to look at this and how we address this holistically, because if you could do several of these multi-property brownfield tax capture districts or TRAs, targeted redevelopment areas, you could start to scale up some of these infrastructure fixes for stormwater management in commercial districts, as well as foster new development. This is especially important in Jefferson Chalmers right now because half of the business district now, from the center line of Jefferson south, we can't deploy city CDBG and city home funds. Norma G's had a lot of CDBG money in it. Our Marlboro apartment buildings had a lot of home money in it. The Kresge building renovation, when they were resource fund, had a lot of CDBG facade money in it. All those are off the table.
Wow.
So we've got to find ways to both fund infrastructure to deal with this, and also how do we navigate the new floodplain reality in Jefferson Chalmers and the Marina District and parts of the villages. And we've got to be more innovative about our tools. So I don't want to be a downer about all this, but it's we need more political leadership on this, and we need more coordination, and we need the desire and willingness to use innovative new financial tools, be it environmental impact bonds, brownfield tax capture districts, and the like. That's part of the challenge we're working on. I didn't even talk about raising the seawalls.
Well, and so that's a story that I frankly think we need to devote a whole different episode on, because that seawall conversation is going to be important, and I think it's going to be crucial with what's happening going forward. And, don't worry about being a downer per se. For this, I think it's about being realistic. If there's anything I think that we could really grow on as a Metro Detroit community, sometimes we need to be realistic to get to the positive. There's a difference between, the doom and gloom and the whatever. To me, you laid out the course and the case of action that we could take to take things to a whole new level. And these are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about. We need to be having these discussions, because without them, we're going to be doing the same thing we've always been doing, which is kind of the definition of insanity.
Yeah, it's pretty insane. But I think, so what we've got to focus on at Jefferson East is, what can we do now?
Right.
And so I think part of this is can we support education and supporting our friends in the city to help them deploy existing funds. So we'll do that through the CDBG-DR training. We're very thankful to our friends at Kresge for supporting that, and our friends at SBP willing to come up here to Detroit to do that. The other piece on it is this fusion between disaster preparation, recovery, and home repair. And so this is where I think we're really spending a lot of our energy right now. So I mentioned, the basement repairs and elevating furnaces. One of the big things we've got to do with our friends at DWSD this summer is make sure that every resident in Jefferson Chalmers can get enrolled in the new basement protection program. So this is the program that the mayor rolled out, in which people will be able to install check valves and sump pumps into their basements. And so we're going to work how we can leverage our relationship with residents as a Detroit Housing Network partner and the Neighborhood Resource Hub there to get folks plugged into this work, and then see how we can deploy additional home repair dollars to further elevate furnaces. I think the other part in Jeff Chalmers is especially true. We have our friends with the University of Michigan, the Sustainability Clinic, the C Sustainability Clinic, kind of looking at what is an overall strategy in that neighborhood for living with water. If you think about JC and if you sort of drive down to like where the old Guyton School is, which by the way was an RFP the city wanted to do, but now they can't because they can't use CDBG or home on it to entice a developer. So that's another fun story. But anyway, if you think about where we have sort of vacant lots in the neighborhood, where those line up with low topography in the neighborhood, can those vacant lots be used to store water during extreme precipitation events? How do we work to inform residents that when rain is forecasted, you need to move your cars off the street and into the driveway or into a different part of the neighborhood so they don't get flooded? How do we set up an alert system for residents so when the flow of wastewater and sewage kicks up, say in Grosse Pointe Park, kind of coming down the pipe, that there could be an alert sent to residents saying, hey, water's rising, be alert, get some things out of your basement. There's a lot of interesting things we can do to sort of it's sort of the sort of academic term is creating a hazard culture, or how do you live with hazards? And so I think if we look at Jefferson East's long history in public safety work, our housing work, I think this is going to be a realm that we're going to be spending our time on. The other piece, I think, is just advocacy for infrastructure. How can we support the city of Detroit in securing the federal funds to upgrade the seawalls, to upgrade the sewer infrastructure, and do what we can help there to advocate on the federal and state level?
I couldn't help but think when you're talking about different ways to live with water. I've been to New Orleans. You've got people coming up from New Orleans. Could you even look at a different style of construction for new houses going forward?
That's spot on. And actually, oddly mentioned that I'm going down next week to New Orleans to meet with SBP Inc. to see some examples of their home repair work and take part in their CDBG DR training before it comes up here to Detroit. But no, we've talked about that. Like when we look at new construction in Jefferson Chalmers, like do we need to get away from basements, right? Do things need to be elevated? The city of Detroit, because that neighborhood is within the floodplain, you basically need to look at establishing whole new building codes to sort of deal with mitigation of the floodplain. So if the city were to look to redevelop parcel 492, so this is the large piece of vacant land that's next to Riverbend Plaza there in Jefferson Chalmers. It's the largest contiguous publicly owned piece of vacant land on a major arterial in Detroit. So it's a prime redevelopment site. But if we're going to redevelop it, the homes that would be built there, basically need to be elevated a little bit. We need to get away from basements. We've got to deal with stormwater runoff on site. All of these things need to be codified in sort of a floodplain management plan that I know the city is working on developing. These are all the things that need to be considered. And we had a great conversation with a former Detroiter who now works out at the City of New York's basically Office of Climate Resiliency. And he was just sort of detailing all the work that New York does in terms of helping urban flooding and design codes. We've got to be able to take it to that level here in Detroit to protect our residents and structure our development patterns and our building types to deal with the new normal and challenges imposed by climate change.
It's the story is really what I'm finding that needs to be talked about here in Metro Detroit. I think a lot of people are lulled because we're not near the sea per se about climate change affecting us. You see all those maps online where it's like, what happens if Manhattan with 1 foot of... I think that actually is completely missing the point now, not just with this conversation, but with a number of them I've had on the show. Climate change is going to be one of the number one issues facing Metro Detroit going forward, bar none.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think our big threat here is going to be water. It's going to be just extreme weather events in general. I mean, because don't forget, we can get massive snow dumps too.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think just what's not only the resiliency of our stormwater and our water infrastructure, what's our resiliency of our electrical infrastructure too? Because you saw that when the electrical feeds went down to the pump stations in Jeff Chalmers, that exacerbated the flooding in Jefferson Chalmers. So we have to look at how we also make our electrical grid much more resilient to protect this critical infrastructure. But these are all things that, and I won't never forget this, when Arthur Jemison, before he left because he got gobbled up by the Biden administration to go, I think he's like the number 2 or the number 3 at HUD now.
Yeah, he's a big deal.
He's a big deal. He's a super nice guy. He said, he's like, the federal government gives out about $8 billion in entitlement CDBG. So that's the normal CDBG funds that go to cities every year. So Detroit gets about $37 million of entitlement CDBG every year. But Arthur said the federal government gives out $80 billion in CDBG disaster recovery funds. So I think that the state and the city and the counties need to get much more adept at effectively deploying CDBG DR funds. And I think this first big batch of 56 million can go a long way. And so that's why we're kind of thrilled we're going to be able to help bring some specialized training up to our friends here in Detroit and Dearborn and the state so we can start building the civic infrastructure or the governmental infrastructure to effectively deploy these federal resources.
Well, I mean, we've covered a ton of stuff, but there's one more thing I want to mention because this is Daily Detroit and we like to have fun, is that Jazzin' at the Vanity is coming up June 18th and 19th. Pretty cool. And because I always look for events and things where people can, if they've never been to Jefferson Chalmers, go see it and go have fun. Or if they're in the neighborhood listening to this, because I know we have listeners in the neighborhood, to know that there's these kind of events happening right where they're at.
Jazz at the Vanity coming back June 18th and 19th. We got a great lineup with James Carter headlining on Saturday night and Ghost Note coming in from LA headlining on Sunday night. We got folks like Marion Hayden. We got RJ Spengler and T-Bone Paxton performing. just a great lineup. And folks can go to jasminatthevanity.com to check out more information on that. But it's going to be a great time on June 18th and 19th. We'll have food, we'll have art. You can come see the new neighborhood resource hub, kids area. I might even be in a dunk tank. So
okay, I'm there. Sold.
Be good. It's gonna be good. It's gonna be good stuff. So, despite all the challenges we faced, we really felt, after, all struggling through COVID together and with the flooding, we really had to bring back something fun for residents just to thank them for toughing it out. It's just gonna be a great time. So yeah, just come on out to East Jefferson and Lakewood there in Jefferson Chalmers on June 18th and 19th, Juneteenth weekend. We'll be thinking about the importance of Juneteenth too. And it's going to be a ton of fun.
Well, Josh Elling, Jefferson East Incorporated, it's always great to talk with you and just get really into the weeds on this stuff. But I feel like I learned a lot.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'd love to chat anytime, man.
Tomorrow, Devin O'Reilly joins me to talk about all the things happening around Metro Detroit. Lots of great conversation topics. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, consider sharing it with a friend. It's the best way to push Detroit's conversation forward. With that, I'm Jer Stays. I appreciate you. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around Detroit.